Hi, this is Nick and this is my director's commentary for Good Company Redux. This quote here is actually from Captain Willard in Apocalypse Now and gives a bit of a tie between Kurtz and Marlowe already. The whole intention of this opening sequence was to really slow down the start of the film, to draw it out and to really set the pace early on. The choice of music was important as well, and actually it was the music that made me put this together in the first place. It's the band Zombie, and they're an Italian metal band. They did the soundtrack for the classic horror movie Dawn of the Dead. It's actually the sort of sequences in the music that made me set up Swish to do the animation so that the titles spread out left and right like that and faded away. We see the hospital and the ward here in this opening sequence, and the intention using those still shots that weren't in the original version was to set up and really slow down the way that the whole hospital gets revealed to you. And the sample at the very start of the film is done Twin Peaks style. Say it forwards, reverse it, say it in verse, flip it back. It gives it a creepy sound. Here we get the first sort of dialogue between characters, myself and Stefan. I slowed his voice down a little bit. It makes the doctor sound a little bit otherworldly. As a viewer, the intention was for people to be a bit confused at this point, not to realise if it was further in the future or back in the past, especially after the coach at the start. Also notice that in this new version I've totally changed the sound effects that goes with the flash forwards or flashbacks or whatever they are that they're integrating themselves into the film. Listening and watching the first version now that I changed for the horror comp, it sounds really tacky hearing those screams there. Jump back to the bus now, and we see Marlowe have a flashback to his conversation with the company executive, voiced by my good friend Sonny Chung. In this section we learn a lot about Kurtz and who he is, and we also start to get a feel for the irony of the title. This executive is asking Marlowe to go back to work after coming out of hospital. The whole film actually plays with the idea of irony. What is said is different to what is meant. Does Marlowe really have good company in the people on his travels? Can he trust them? Are they telling the truth? This is probably the part I'm least happy with animation-wise. I tried to time it and audio sync it, and I got much better as the film went along, but this looks terrible. Also notice in the background at the right, there's the face mask and the pith helmet as a throwback to the original Heart of Darkness and the travel up the Congo. What happens in this conversation is quite important, and it was cut back a bit for the 10-minute version. There's bits and pieces that were taken out. Also, if you look at the production shots on the website, you'll notice there was supposed to be a laptop in this table. I couldn't get it at the right angle, so I took it out. We have an announcement from the bus driver, voiced by Chris Callahan, another good friend of mine. And Rivermouth Distribution Station is where they're headed. It's where he runs into his first problem. That's his transport up the river, and in this case, up the road up to the outpost hut.
Hello? Coming. Hello.
And I still really like the way this handshake looks. It worked very well. There's problems along the way, and of course the first one is that in the novel the boat has been damaged before he's got there, and it takes quite a long time for it to be fixed. It seems almost like somebody's interfering with it being fixed. We've got the distribution manager here. He's voiced by Ray, and I think he's just done a wonderful job with that character, and so in character. And here we are with the mechanic, voiced by Nate, fantastically, so in character here. And I'm really pleased with the look of all the grease stains on his uniform. We learn a bit about Marlowe and his seeming confusion about events and ownership, and times it seems like that the mechanic might know more about what's going on than maybe Marlowe realises. And here we go, we're waiting on parts, but Marlowe looks around and sees that there's heaps of parts. I'm not sure that this actually came through the way I intended it to, that there were plenty of parts, and you know, what's this go with parts not being available? And of course here we learn that Kurtz was a past owner of the car, and the mechanic hasn't seen who Kurtz is, so we can't make any links or backgrounds or discussions here with who Kurtz actually is. Onto the coffee conversation, and another flash. in here where we get a bit of a glimpse of maybe who this Kurt's character is, and in fact he was in the earlier flashes as well, but only sort of subliminally a fraction of a second. Had great fun with some of the Foley here, putting the cup sounds, and one of the things you may have noticed with the Redux cut is that I played a lot with panning, so there's a lot of left to right channel stuff going on. This is quite an important conversation because a number of different characters are brought up, and they could be the same person, but it seems like Distribution Manager and Marlowe aren't on the same wavelength here. They at times seem to be talking about the same thing, and at times they seem to not be understanding each other. And that's kind of the point of this scene. And of course we get to learn about Kurtz has unusual management techniques, as with the executive conversation earlier on, and this is where the distribution manager seems to get a bit concerned about the role Kurtz may have if he's going to move on from the mining outpost to actually running the distribution station here, which seems to have more prestige. And notice the in the background there's a shield and a little pike spear at the back, and once again another throwback to the original Heart of Darkness, the whole going into the Congo and those types of things, early exploration. This is a new scene here. I really like the engine hanging above the car, and once again this kind of develops that maybe the mechanic here knows more about the whole situation, and it was really unfortunate that I had to edit this out of the 10-minute version. This scene begs the question, poses the question whether or not the distribution manager has got a phone call or not, whether he's deciding to come due to paranoia. You just don't know. Of course there's some comedy going on in the background. And as I said about new scenes, the big conversations before the executive and the coffee conversation, bits were cut out of those for the 10-minute cut. It messed with the flow a little bit, so I'm happy to have those bits reintegrated. Okay, so the journey's started now, the car's fixed. Got some post-production lights there, and we've seen a light at the side of the road, so for some reason Marlowe, in a very hammy voice, decides to slow down and check it out, which is pretty much a movie cliche here. You just have to check out the weird thing by the side of the road. Now this scene was cut down heavily for the 10-minute version. Once they discover the petrol in the rear of the car, well, they fill it up, and then an incident happens and we have a shooting. Originally, and it was that I had in the original script, and of course Ray recorded all the audio for it as well, is we have the distribution manager being very concerned about traps, and Marlowe plays a trick on him, and this is another side of Marlowe's character that we don't see, that he has got this kind of vindictive nature. Okay, we're into another new scene here. This is one of my favourite scenes in the film, and even when setting up for the horror comp I realised I was going to run out of time and not be able to film enough, so this is actually filmed after the horror comp. It's in the original script, and it's sort of like a scene from the book where they're travelling up the river in a boat and they're stuck in fog. Now they start to hear some sounds. Marlowe says he thinks it might be drums, and it's actually a combination of 3 sounds. It's helicopter sounds in there that then leads into drums, and then the motorbikes. So the motorbikes ties in with what happens later on, and the helicopters are kind of like that's the Apocalypse Now tie-in, Francis Ford Coppola's version of Heart of Darkness. Now we've just seen as well that there's been a blowout, and there's a bang before the blowout. And now this is where it picks up from in the 10-minute version. We cut straight to this bit here. You can notice the tyres missing from the front wheel, and that's in the 10-minute version as well. Some rustling in the bushes, and then next thing you know, the manager's dead, and Marlowe is extremely confused. We see more flashes from some dark chained area, and of course we're into day now. Finally meet Steve, the guy that left the car and the petrol and the fuel, and Steve's character, or the outcast character, it was pretty much written for the Steve character, Nate Burr's Steve character from the Steve and Dave films. It was kind of discussions ages ago that we talked about maybe having cameos in each other's films, and Good Company actually took a lot longer to get off the ground, to get to the point where there was a big role. Initially he was going to have the stripy shirt that Steve wears, but it didn't seem to fit, and we'd already done some cameos, so I thought if I left the shirt in the boot of the car, which you may have noticed further back, and dressed Steve up in this jacket, well, he kind of looked a bit more like an outcast and a biker. I was really pleased with the way that when I wrote the script, I felt like Steve was saying it, and when Nate recorded the lines and there was some ad-libbing in there, it just came out perfectly. He's kind of based on the photographer character from Apocalypse Now, and of course the Harlequin in Heart of Darkness, a kind of intermediate person between Kurtz and Marlowe. And we heard before that when Marlowe tells Steve his name, Steve is a bit unsure of that. He even seems unsure if it's actually his real name. And here's my favourite change of focus, which I was really pleased when people noticed that when I released Good Company the first time. And we learn a bit about the background of Kurtz's staff in this mine here. And of course there's motorbikes that we had the sounds going to before. This scene I had to cut down as well for the 10-minute version. Steve gets to talk a little bit more about how he feels about the situation with Kurtz. I also got to change the audio for the bike when he rides off, add some panning, make the startups sound a lot beefier. Generally I'm much happier with the way that this particular scene here finishes as opposed to the 10-minute version. I actually really enjoyed making the sets for this part of the film. The hut, the trees in the background, and the mine in the distance. As we enter this mine sequence, there's a number of different shots and different light levels, and shot on different nights. I don't think they're integrated particularly well. I tried to play with the grain to make them fit better. You'll probably notice it more now that I've mentioned it. Music kicks in. It's this weird piano sample that I got from somewhere on the web, and it worked perfectly. I loved having the legs in the bin and the head on the stake, and if you notice down to the right as well, there's a barrel with horns and another spear, so once again another tie into that whole Heart of Darkness idea. Another problem with the 10-minute version is that the ending isn't long enough to build up enough tension in the mind, and I get to explore that more with this version. Of course, this ending sequence doesn't help to solve many problems. More questions are raised than answered, and my intention the whole time has been to make what happens outside of the context of the movie more important than the movie itself. I got to add more flashes that I wanted to in here, more confusion, better control of sound effects. I like the use of the scream, and the whole finding the photo idea was how I initially intended it to be, without the hammy voiceover where I explained everything at the end of the 10-minute cut. And of course the horror, the classic phrase from Heart of Darkness used in Apocalypse Now and parodied all over the place. To me, some of the shots in this sequence still look really disturbing, the juxtaposition really of a nice innocent Lego with these sort of issues of implied violence and horror of some sort. And the voice that's calling out to Marlowe. I think that adds immensely to the way that this sequence in the film actually ends up. Really helps to reinforce the cyclic nature of the film, ending up where it begins.